The SUV idled at a red light. The countdown timer on the traffic signal showed 32 seconds until green. Inside the vehicle, it was warm, almost stuffy. Ethan, 40 years old, leaned his head back against the headrest, listening to the steady hum of the heater. He figured they'd be home in another 15 minutes, and that thought was the only thing sustaining him after 3 hours behind the wheel. Beside him, Audrey, 43, was dozing, her head swaying slightly with the engine's vibration. In the back seat, 16-year-old Piper was scrolling through her phone. Outside was a vast, inky, freezing night, 15 degrees below zero, lit by rare streetlights that felt utterly indifferent to human life. Just as everyone in the car was lost in their own thoughts, Ethan noticed a movement. It was low, almost a crawl, a couple of scrawny, reddish-brown shapes crossing the wide pavement, moving from a dark warehouse district toward the shoulder. He squinted. A cat, a ginger tabby that had long been neglected, was moving, driven by one last desperate instinct. 3 hours ago, he had been chased out of a warm boiler vent, and in those 3 hours, his body had turned into a block of ice. His fur, matted with dampness and filth, no longer held any heat. His breathing was short and wheezing. Every paw that touched the asphalt, covered in a sharp, icy crust, sent a signal of unbearable, searing pain to his brain. The cat wasn't looking for food, he was looking for life. His stomach clenched with cramps, but hunger had become secondary. The primary goal was a single one, a source of warmth. He saw the SUV not as a deadly threat, but as a huge black stationary iceberg radiating the engine's saving heat. The vehicle was standing right next to him. Wasting no time on hesitation, the cat lunged forward. The dash was weak but fierce. He stumbled up to the front tire, barely staying upright from weakness, and clinging to the rubber and metallic parts, he clambered onto the dark, heated hood. Immediately, right beneath his belly, the long-awaited, incredible warmth pulsed. It washed over him in a gentle wave, and for the first time in days, the cat felt the muscles in his back stop being rigid. He curled up on the hood and, completely forgetting that he needed to hide, raised his head. Through the dirty, streaked windshield, he saw the people. He saw Ethan. The man, in turn, stared at him. There was glass between them, but the cat looked straight through it. His eyes were wide open with a mixture of panic and pleading. There was no animal stupidity in that gaze. There was absolute human despair. "What is it?" Audrey asked softly, sleepily, opening her eyes. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't look away. The cat was staring at him, and he could see the small body trembling beneath the matted fur. The cat began to make quiet, almost soundless noises, more like a dry, raspy cough than a meow. Piper finally tore herself away from her phone. She saw the thin ginger silhouette on the hood pressed against the glass and instantly understood. "That's not just an animal. That's a creature begging to be saved. Dad?" Piper's voice was quiet, but a steely note cut through it. "He's cold. He's just warming up," Ethan mumbled. His rational mind told him that this was a wild animal, dirty, possibly sick, and that he should shoo it away. But the cat's eyes pierced right through those rational arguments. The traffic light switched to yellow. "Go, Ethan," Audrey said, rubbing her temples. "Don't get involved. It's a stray." But Ethan didn't move. A lump formed in his throat. He saw the steam rising from the hood, mingling with the animal's short white breaths. He saw the desperate, haunted look that spoke of months of suffering. The cat, realizing he was being watched, lifted a front paw. It was crooked. A broken claw stuck out sideways. He drew that paw across the glass, as if trying to wipe away the barrier between them. The gesture was almost conscious. "Ethan, it's green!" Audrey exclaimed, pointing at the light. An impatient horn honked behind them. In a split second, Ethan made a decision he hadn't time to think about. He lowered the driver's side window. The cold, biting air immediately rushed into the cabin, overpowering the heater's warmth. "What are you doing?" Audrey cried out. The cat on the hood immediately felt a new wave of heat, the heat coming from the cabin. And he understood. It was an invitation. He didn't hesitate. He pushed off the hood, slid across the windshield, and squeezed through the narrow gap of the open window, dropping heavily onto the leather seat between Ethan and Audrey. The landing was clumsy. The cat instantly tucked his head into his shoulders. He curled into the smallest ball he could manage and began to shake. This wasn't just shivering from the cold, it was the internal, uncontrollable spasm of an exhausted organism that had suddenly found safety. Ethan, ignoring the honk from behind, slowly raised the window. He looked at Audrey, whose jaw had dropped in astonishment, and at Piper, who had suddenly leaned forward, resting her forehead on the back of his seat.
"Let's go,"
Ethan said firmly, his voice hoarse. The cat, pressed against the soft texture of the seat, didn't dare move. The smell of leather, the warmth, the unfamiliar but non-hostile sense of people, all of it was too strange. He was breathing heavily, his sides heaving, but he felt it. He felt that he was no longer freezing. Most importantly, he saw Ethan's hand, which a second ago had seemed like an enormous cliff, slowly reach toward his head. The hand stopped in the air. Piper finally broke the silence, pulling back. "I'm keeping him. He's ours." Audrey just sighed, realizing she had already lost this battle. Ethan pressed the gas pedal, and the car pulled forward. "My God," Audrey breathed out, disbelieving her eyes. "What just happened?" In place of an answer, a sharp metallic odor, mixed with the smell of wet dirt and soggy fur, hung in the cabin. It was the first hint of the life this ginger creature had been living. Ethan drove slowly. His gaze was fixed on the dashboard, but his mind was far away. He felt the cat's weight on the seat. He felt his warm body absorbing the icy lump they had just let into their world. What had compelled him? Ethan, a construction engineer, had always been a man of logic and order. There was no room for spontaneous decisions in his life. He went to work knowing exactly what he would do, and he came home knowing exactly that the faucet was leaking and needed to be fixed. But the eyes of that cat, pressed against the windshield, were not just the gaze of an animal. It was a pure, unclouded plea for rescue, so clear and desperate that the cat seemed to be speaking a human language. The cat's eyes were huge, the color of autumn copper, and they reflected all the blackness of that frozen road. Ethan suddenly recalled his own fear, the one he had experienced in his youth when he fell off a ski trail and waited 2 hours for help in a snow pit. He had felt the same thing then, a panicked, total dependence on someone else's decision. That was why he couldn't drive through the green light. That was why his hand automatically reached for the window button. Ethan hadn't opened the door for the cat. He had opened it for his own forgotten fear. "We can't leave him out here, can we?" Piper finally said. She leaned forward and stretched her palm out toward the cat. The animal didn't move. It was incapable of reacting. From the shock and the sudden change in temperature, its body was convulsing with large, uncontrollable tremors. He lay on his side, his thin muzzle pressed against the seat. His ears, torn in street fights, were tightly pressed against his head. Audrey turned around and looked tenderly at her daughter. Piper, at 16, was usually cool and withdrawn, immersed in her headphones and phone, but now her face was soft, filled with a compassion Audrey hadn't seen in a long time. "He's dying, Mom," Piper whispered. Ethan silently turned on the seat warmer. He felt the cat, sensing the heat from below, start to move slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Fine," Audrey said wearily, "but you realize what this means? First, the vet, then Jasper." Jasper. Jasper was the 7-year-old, pampered, purebred Persian who considered himself the sole master of the house. Ethan felt uneasy thinking about how his aristocratic favorite would react to this smelly, scrawny street creature. "We'll get him home, Piper," Ethan said, looking in the rearview mirror. "And tomorrow morning, I'll take him to a shelter. We'll see what the vet says."
No.
Piper's voice was sharp. "No shelter. He chose us, Dad. He jumped into our car." Piper slowly, very slowly, brought her hand toward the ginger creature. She didn't try to pet him. She simply placed her palm on the armrest next to his head, letting him know she was there. The cat didn't react to the movement. His tiny body seemed weightless, just bones wrapped in wet fur. A faint, acidic smell of fear and sickness emanated from him. But after a minute, the longest minute of Piper's life, something happened that made her gasp. The cat, without lifting his head, pressed his cheek against the soft fabric covering her wrist. It was a reflex-level touch, a gesture of absolute trust toward the first source of warmth and softness he had encountered. His uncontrollable shaking slowly began to subside, replaced by a finer internal tremor. Piper felt this contact like an electric current. She felt every fragile vertebra, every tiny bone beneath his fur. "His paw is hot," she mumbled. "He must have a fever." Audrey immediately reached into her bag for a scarf. She turned back and, ignoring the filth, carefully covered the cat with her wool scarf. Wrapped in the soft, warm fabric, the cat finally released his tension and closed his eyes. For the first time in 2 days, he felt relatively safe. Ethan, looking at his quiet family and the sleeping animal, realized his life had already changed. He hadn't just let a stray cat into his life. He had let in a problem that had suddenly brought his family together more than years of shared living. He looked at the road sign. They were almost home. Ethan parked the car in the driveway and turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. In that silence, they could clearly hear only the cat's breathing, which remained short and shallow. They sat like that for several seconds. It was as if no one dared to break this fragile moment, this portal through which strange pain had just stormed into their orderly lives. Piper finally moved first. She slowly removed the wool scarf Audrey had given the cat. The cat was ready to flee. Even though his physical exhaustion was absolute, the instinct for self-preservation, honed over long months on the streets, kept him on alert. Even inside the warm car next to the people, his muscles remained tense, ready to bolt at any second if the slightest threat appeared. Piper reached out to lift him, but stopped. She remembered that any sudden movement could trigger panic. "Easy, Gus," she whispered. Her voice was gentle, almost a lullaby. "I want to pick you up, little one. Look at me." The cat slowly, with effort, lifted his head. He didn't look at Piper's hand, which could strike, or at her body. He looked directly into her eyes. His pupils, dilated with darkness and fear, searched for something familiar, something human, kindness or danger. He weighed the two options, and the scales seemed to hang in perfect balance. A second. 2. Then the cat made a leap. It wasn't a leap to escape. It was a final lunge for help. He collapsed right into Piper's lap. Her jeans made her knees stiff, but they were warm. The cat, Gus, not yet named, let out a sound like a quiet, pitiful moan, and immediately began to shake with renewed force. This was not just cold shivering. It was the release of built-up tension, a bodily hysteria that suddenly realized the fight was over. Ethan and Audrey watched the scene without moving. Seeing their daughter, usually so reserved, gently hug the dirty, scrawny animal, Audrey felt her throat tighten. "He's so hot." Piper squeezed the cat tighter. "He's burning up." She felt every bone, every angular rib sticking out through his ginger fur. His entire anatomy screamed of hunger and cold. Piper felt a sudden, intense wave of nausea from the realization of what this animal had been through to get into their car. She clenched her teeth to keep from crying. She felt her body shake in unison with the cat's trembling body. She lowered her head and buried her face in his fur, ignoring the sharp street smell. "It's quiet. You're home," Piper barely whispered, rocking him. Audrey found Ethan's old worn jacket. She reached back and carefully covered the cat, wrapping him up like a baby. Ethan finally opened his door and got out of the car, letting one more burst of icy air into the cabin. "Take him to the bathroom," he ordered. "Carefully. I'll come up now and find the old carrier. The vet, first thing tomorrow." "No, Dad." Piper looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. "Not the carrier. He's staying. I won't give him up." Ethan wanted to argue. He wanted to talk about Jasper, about illness, about the shelter, about how this wasn't their responsibility. But he saw an unwavering resolution in the eyes of his daughter and his wife. He saw that there was no room for compromise in those eyes. The family had already made a decision while he was preoccupied with driving. Ethan sighed. His shoulders, tense from the long drive, dropped. Not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. "Fine," he said, his voice deep. "Fine. But you are responsible for him. Understood?" "Understood," Piper smiled through her tears. They slowly went up to the apartment. Jasper, lazy and plump, was in the kitchen. He raised his head, looked at Piper's bundle, and his face expressed utter bewilderment before he put his head back down on his paws. He hadn't yet grasped the magnitude of the tragedy. Audrey immediately set about creating a sanctuary. In a dark corner of the guest bedroom, where Jasper never slept, she laid down an old soft blanket and placed a heating pad beneath it. Piper carefully unwrapped the cat. He lay limply in her arms, but his breathing was a little deeper. He was still shaking, but now it was from the warmth. Piper saw his face up close and realized he had very beautiful eyes, bright, amber-colored ginger. "Gus," Piper said softly. "You'll be Gus." The cat, hearing a human voice that wasn't screaming or threatening, twitched one of his whiskers. He turned away from the light and pressed his nose into the warm blanket. For the first time in days, Gus wasn't just sleeping. He was collapsing into slumber. It was a sleep without nightmares, a sleep that signified not just rest, but salvation. His body, curled up in a ball, finally relaxed, and his muscles stopped feeling like steel. The smell of the heated pad, the softness of the blanket, the quiet footsteps around him, all of it was an absolute, previously unseen peace. He had miraculously survived. And now, in the warmth, he surrendered. He was surrendering not to the cold, but to safety. Gus's sleep was restless, even though he was wrapped in warmth and in the complete darkness of the bedroom corner. His tiny brain kept replaying scenes from the last few months. It started with a smell. the smell of damp, rotting cabbage that was overpowered by the strong scent of gasoline. His body suddenly tensed. Through his sleep he felt something heavy crushing his back, and a thin, fierce cry tore from his lips. The cry wasn't loud, but it was full of pain and terror. Piper, who was sitting on the floor next to his bed, instantly tensed up. The cat was twitching. His back legs, resting on the warm blanket, were jerking in rapid, sharp spasms. He was seeing the past, the sudden kick of a boot that sent him flying. Then, the week when every movement resulted in a sharp pain in his side. He saw the fight over a piece of fish near the dockside warehouse, the freezing rain that hadn't stopped for 3 days. Tears welled up in Piper's eyes. She slowly, so as not to scare him, placed her hand on his back. A touch. Warmth. Not a blow, but a caress. The spasms slowed. Gus felt a gentle pressure that carried not a threat, but protection. His frequent panicked breathing became deeper. He cracked one eye open. The amber pupils slid across the hand that rested on his side. Piper began to speak. She told him about her school, her unfinished literature homework, and a silly fight with her best friend. She spoke evenly and quietly. Her voice was like the monotonous sound of water. She knew he didn't understand the words, but he understood the intonation. Lulled by the gentle, steady narrative, Gus was finally able to relax the muscles in his back and neck. He fell back into a deep sleep. Ethan quietly opened the door and peeked into the bedroom. He saw Piper sitting on the floor and the ginger ball of fur pressed against her arm. He felt a surge of something strange, not pride, but peace. For the last few years, Piper had been a closed book to them, always in headphones, always preoccupied with her 16-year-old problems. But now she was here, focused and responsible. Ethan walked over to his wife, who was standing by the door, and took her wrist. He felt the familiar roughness of the skin on her hand. "Do you think he'll make it?" he asked quietly. "He already made it, Ethan," Audrey replied. Her voice was low. "He broke through the frost and the glass. He just needs our help now." Ethan looked at the sleeping cat several times, and details caught his attention. A piece was missing from the left ear, as if torn out. There was an old, healed scar beneath his eye. On his side, which Piper was carefully covering, a bald patch with scars was visible. These were the traces not of a life, but of survival. "We need to get him to a specialist," Ethan decided. "First thing tomorrow." "Of course. I'm already looking up clinics." Audrey rested her head on his shoulder. There were no long dialogues between them, but in that silent exchange of glances, Ethan understood they were thinking the same thing. How would this change their lives? Ethan thought about Jasper, his Persian, who had never known hunger or cold, and who considered any cardboard box a personal tragedy. How would they get along? Ethan loved Jasper for his composure, his regal calm. And this Gus. He was a wildfire, a spark that could either burn or warm their home. Audrey, meanwhile, was mentally tallying the upcoming expenses: examination, blood work, vaccinations. Their family budget was carefully planned, but she knew she couldn't look away when an animal's life depended on a few $100s. Piper, by that time, was completely absorbed in Gus. She stroked him and felt life pulsing beneath her fingers. Her only thought was, "I won't let him die on my watch." At 16, she felt truly needed for the first time. The cat, Gus, sensing that the tension in the room had dissipated, took a deep breath. He opened his eyes, saw the muted light of the nightlight, the soft contours of the room, and nuzzled Piper's palm. The gesture was not gratitude, but recognition. "You are my warmth." Piper slowly pulled her hand away to grab a glass of water from the nightstand. At that moment, the cat, Gus, instinctively searching for the lost heat, shifted and pressed his bald side against her jeans. He wasn't looking for the blanket, he was looking for the person. Ethan, watching all this, felt not exhaustion for the first time that evening, but a quiet, warm weight in his heart. Tenderness. This small, scrawny shadow, brought in from the frost, had already managed to awaken something in his family that had been dormant for a long time. He kissed his wife on the top of her head. "Let's go." Audrey and Ethan left, leaving Gus and Piper alone. The cat, pressed against his rescuer's legs, finally fell asleep without twitching. In that moment, neither cold nor hunger existed for him. Only the promise that tomorrow would be another day. The contrast between where Gus had spent his last night and where he was now was staggering. Just a few hours ago he was pressed against the frozen pavement, and now he was lying in Piper's soft lap, wrapped in a warm throw. But this peace didn't last long. Audrey and Ethan acted quickly, realizing every minute counted. While Piper rocked Gus in the bedroom, Audrey, without even taking off her coat, was calling the 24-hour veterinary clinic. "Exhaustion, high temperature, clear signs of trauma and frostbite," she reported curtly to the doctor. Ethan, meanwhile, had to resolve the Jasper problem. The Persian, sitting proudly by his bowl in the kitchen, expressed a high degree of arrogant displeasure. He sensed a foreign smell, sharp, alien, reeking of the street and danger. When Piper came out of the room, carrying Gus wrapped in the warm throw, Jasper finally saw the intruder. Jasper didn't hiss. He only let out a drawn-out, deep, disdainful sound that signified the highest degree of insult. He retreated half a step. The pristine white fur on his scruff rose slightly. He couldn't believe his owners were holding this dirty, scrawny creature. Gus, hearing that commanding, pure sound, immediately tensed up. He flinched as if shocked, and his trembling transferred to Piper's arms. Instinct dictated, "The enemy is stronger." He instinctively pressed himself against Piper, seeking not defense, but concealment. "We'll be right back, Jasper," Piper said, looking at the Persian standing rigid on the table. Ethan quickly moved Jasper to another room to avoid an immediate fight, and only then helped Audrey get the carrier. The trip to the clinic was agonizing. Gus, barely recovered from the shock in the car, was moving again, trapped in a plastic box. He thrashed inside, trying to find a way out. His heavy, rapid breathing fogged up the carrier walls. "Calm down, Gus," Piper whispered, slipping a finger through the grate. "I'm here." The clinic was dominated by a sharp aroma of disinfectant and something sickly sweet, medicinal, overpowering all other smells. Piper held the carrier tightly against herself. Ethan filled out the paperwork. After a few minutes they were called in. Gus, seeing the doctor, a tall man in a white coat, predictably panicked. He buried his nose in a corner, refusing to move. Piper, without asking permission, opened the carrier, took the cat out, and placed him directly on the exam table. "Don't worry, he won't bite," she said. The cat was drenched in sweat and fear. The doctor, middle-aged with tired eyes, began the examination. He pressed on the abdomen. Gus cried out softly. "Severe exhaustion, signs of dehydration," the doctor dictated to the nurse, "and it looks like an old rib trauma. Possibly he was kicked." Piper inhaled sharply. The physical pain Gus had suffered suddenly touched her, causing a feeling of sharp cold beneath her shoulder blades. The doctor examined his ears and teeth. "He's not old, maybe 3 years, but look at the teeth. Severe calculus. That speaks to poor nutrition. But the main thing— The doctor took a scanner. There's a microchip. All three froze. A chip. That meant he had been a house cat. The chip is old. Did you call the owners? Audrey asked. The chip isn't active. It hasn't been registered recently, but we'll check, the doctor replied. Now, the most important thing. He needs an IV drip. He is critically dehydrated. And we'll take blood for leukemia and immunodeficiency tests. Stray cats are always a risk. Ethan stood with his arms crossed over his chest, feeling his wrists tense up. He was thinking that this was no longer just a rescue. It was treatment. It was money. It was a risk to Jasper. "How much will this cost?" he asked quietly. The doctor named a sum that silenced Audrey. It was a daunting amount, but Audrey immediately nodded. "We agree," she said. "Do everything he needs." Piper looked at her mother gratefully. When the nurse gently carried Gus into the treatment room, Piper suddenly noticed something strange. There was a tiny, barely visible ginger freckle on the cat's nose. It seemed to her the sweetest, most touching thing she had ever seen. Ethan, Audrey, and Piper sat in the hallway, listening to the quiet, monotonous sound of the IV machine connected to their cat. They waited, and that waiting was the start of a new shared chapter in their lives. They stayed at the clinic until morning. Gus was kept under observation, connected to the IV drip, and the family returned home with a full list of recommendations: special soft food, vitamins, parasite treatment, and, most importantly, strict quarantine. The next day, Gus returned. For him, returning to the apartment, although a rescue, became a new ordeal. The place that was supposed to be a refuge was filled with uncertainty. That's why, for the first 3 days, Gus didn't come out from under the guest room bed. It was his conscious choice. Under the bed, it was dark and dusty, but safe. The soft blanket Audrey had laid out lay nearby, but the cat preferred the cold, hard floor. He didn't trust softness. During the day, when the sun broke through the thick curtains, he lay curled into a thin horseshoe shape. He didn't eat. Piper placed the bowl of the recommended soft, meat-smelling food right at the edge of the bed, but Gus turned away. His stomach had been clenched from hunger for so long that even now, with food available, the instinct to conserve energy outweighed his appetite. Piper didn't force him. She was just nearby. Every morning and evening she sat on the floor and quietly read aloud. They weren't fairy tales, but her history textbook. Her monotonous, calm voice, free of sharp intonations, was the only constant sound in his life. On the 3rd day, a tiny change occurred. The cat didn't come out, but when Piper put the bowl down, he didn't immediately turn away. His nostrils twitched, catching the rich scent. Piper didn't move, continuing to read about the Spartacus revolt. And then Gus slowly, very slowly, crawled out from under the bed, only his head and front paws. His movements were uncertain. Every movement seemed like a major, separate effort. He looked at the bowl, then at Piper, then back at the bowl, and suddenly he made a sharp dash, ate 2 spoonfuls of food, and immediately darted back into the darkness under the bed. "See?" Piper whispered, her eyes shining. "He ate." Progress began from that day. By the 4th day, he was coming out more often and eating half the bowl. On the 5th day, Piper, sitting on the floor, leaned over and stretched her hand out toward him. She didn't try to pet him, she just left her palm flat on the floor. The cat, having eaten, crawled out again. He didn't hide. He walked over to her, stopped by her elbow, and finally pressed his side against her. This contact was more important to Piper than all the words. She felt the warmth emanating from him and heard a faint but clear rattling sound. Purring. Gus was purring. This sound meant that the fear had retreated. He understood he was safe. This change did not go unnoticed. Ethan, seeing the purring cat, genuinely laughed for the first time all week. "Well, look at that! He's alive!" Audrey noticed how Piper, who used to spend hours on the internet, now made sure Gus always had fresh water, and that he ate strictly on schedule. Their daughter was becoming more responsible and gentler. The cat, without knowing it, was turning the teenager into a person. Ethan and Audrey started talking about Gus more often. Over dinner, which they had almost stopped having together due to busy schedules, they discussed his progress, comparing his behavior with Jasper's. The cat, like an invisible anchor, began pulling the family together. "We need to read up on how to care for cats with rib injuries," Audrey said. "Let me look it up," Ethan replied. And for the first time in a long time, they both leaned over the laptop, reading the same article. Gus did not go under the bed that evening. He stayed in the corner, on the soft blanket. He wasn't sleeping on the bed. He wasn't lying next to the people. He didn't yet believe that this safety would last forever. He just watched them from his corner, watching and absorbing the warmth and light. One week followed another. The days flew by in a monotonous rhythm of feeding, reading, and quiet conversations. Gus changed slowly but steadily. The most important change occurred in his eyes. The panic in his gaze, which haunted him even in his sleep, began to fade. His eyes became calm, almost thoughtful. They no longer darted around the corners of the room, looking for a threat. He looked at the world with the curiosity that is always inherent in cats. His ribs, which had seemed like sharp angles piercing his skin in the first few days, became less noticeable. He began to gain weight. Gus's body rounded out, and his muscles regained their elasticity. His street agility, once necessary for hunting and escaping, now manifested in games. He began to explore the house. His favorite place became the bookshelves. He would jump onto the lower shelves and sniff the old covers, and then, gathering his courage, he would make a dash for the very top. His movements were fast and graceful. One evening, while the family was having dinner, something happened that made everyone laugh. Gus, who now moved freely around the apartment, sneaked into the kitchen. He stood on his hind legs by the table, stretched out a front paw, and instantly, with surprising dexterity, snatched a piece of fried chicken left on Ethan's plate. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. "Did you see that? Street smarts!" Piper burst out laughing. Audrey, instead of scolding the animal, placed another small piece of meat on the edge of the table. "Eat up, little thief," she whispered. This was their new family tradition, accepting his slyness. They understood that the instinct to steal wasn't a bad habit, but a deeply ingrained survival program. Gus began to sleep with his family. He didn't sleep in Piper's bed, as they had expected. He was attracted to Ethan's feet. In his huge, warm body, the cat found the safest refuge. Gus would lie right on Ethan's feet, curl up in a ball, and begin to purr loudly and deeply, like a tiny, content engine. Ethan, who had always considered himself a dog person, suddenly discovered that he liked it. His feet relaxed under the cat's warm, vibrating weight. He started falling asleep faster. One night, Audrey woke up and saw in the dim nightlight how Ethan, lying on his side, was cautiously stroking Gus. There was an expression of tenderness on her husband's face that Audrey hadn't seen in a long time. The cat was healing not only himself, but their family, too. Ethan, usually closed off and quiet, became softer. He began to take an interest not only in work problems, but also in what was bothering Piper. He would ask her about Gus, and through the cat, he found a way to talk to his daughter about her own life. Audrey, who had always been afraid to open her heart fully after the disappointments of her youth, now accepted Gus's love unconditionally. The cat demanded nothing but warmth and food, and his absolute trust in her helped her believe in kindness again. Piper, at 16, found the perfect listener in Gus. She would tell him about her problems while holding him. The cat listened without judging or giving advice. Gus became the family's anchor. He still hadn't befriended Jasper. They lived on opposite poles, circling each other widely, but they no longer hissed. Jasper simply pretended Gus didn't exist. It was a cold but safe war. Gus, fed, warm, and loved, gradually forgot the cold. He no longer hid. He chose the sun, the sofa, and, of course, Ethan's feet. His old scars, visible beneath his now clean fur, became just part of his history. They spoke not of pain, but of his incredible will to win. The unexpected event didn't happen in a second. It matured slowly, like a long-awaited fruit. But when it did happen, it was a complete surprise to the whole family. A month later, after the visit to the vet and the start of treatment, Gus had fully recovered. He was no longer scrawny, but a lean, strong cat. His ginger fur, washed and nourished with vitamins, shone with health, shimmering in the sunlight. Jasper, the aristocrat, the king of the house, continued to strictly adhere to his strategy of ignorance. He didn't look at Gus even when he walked by. If Gus entered the room, Jasper would either get up and leave or simply turn his head, pretending to stare at a very important spot on the wall. Piper and Audrey had already resigned themselves. There would be no friendship, only neutrality. And then, one quiet Saturday evening, as Ethan was reading the newspaper in his chair and Audrey was knitting on the sofa, it happened. Gus was lying on the edge of the sofa, curled up in a tight ball. Jasper, who always considered that sofa his throne, slowly walked over, jumped onto it, and settled down on the opposite end. A meter separated them. Neither of them hissed, and neither left. Ethan slowly, painstakingly lowered his newspaper. He didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid of breaking the fragile balance. 15 minutes passed. Both cats were dozing. Jasper regally stretched out his paws, Gus with his tail pressed to his side. Then Gus shifted. He slowly raised his head. Jasper instantly opened one eye. The tension in the air became almost physical. Gus, taking a deep breath, slowly, very slowly, crawled closer. Jasper didn't react. He simply closed his eye, demonstrating absolute but fragile indifference. A minute later, Gus crawled closer still. He stopped 5 centimeters from the Persian. He carefully studied his fluffy, snow-white side. And finally, Gus performed a gesture that was both an act of submission and recognition. He stood up and began to groom Jasper's neck with his rough, warm tongue. It was a bathing gesture that cats only perform on their closest companions. Jasper, who could have exploded at such an intrusion, initially tensed his entire body. His ears twitched slightly, but he didn't push him away. He closed his eyes and allowed Gus, the street fighter, to perform the ritual. Piper, seeing this, screamed with joy. It wasn't a shriek, but a muffled, happy squeal. Ethan and Audrey exchanged a long, warm glance. They embraced, their eyes glued to the sofa, where 2 cats, 2 opposites, had finally found common ground. Jasper, the aristocratic cat, had allowed Gus, the survivor cat, to groom him. It was a gesture of respect. Jasper had recognized in Gus a fighter who had earned his place in the house. Sometimes they even played. The game was clumsy. Jasper, lazy and slow, tired quickly. Gus, nimble and jumpy, tried to rile him up. Gus learned to be a house cat. Jasper learned not to be the only one. The next day, when Piper entered the living room, she saw them again. Gus and Jasper were sleeping in the same cat bed, not snuggled, but not avoiding each other either. Their two worlds, the world of peace and the world of war, had merged into one. The scars on Gus's face, his thin, vibrating tail, which he now thumped on the floor when he was content, all of it now spoke of victory. A victory not over the street, but over himself. He didn't just survive, he lived, and he learned to share his home. Gus's internal state changed dramatically. The biggest difference from his previous life was the absence of constant internal noise. Before, it had been an endless stream of anxiety. Where to hide, where to find food, who is the enemy? It was a daily, exhausting struggle that clenched his muscles and prevented him from relaxing even in his sleep. Now, there was silence in his head. A silence that allowed him to simply exist. His days became predictable, and this predictability became his healing. Wake up, eat, enjoy the morning sunbeam on the sofa, calmly observe Ethan reading the newspaper. He no longer felt the need to hide. His body finally believed what his instincts were afraid to accept. He was safe. Sometimes, a quiet memory of the past would surface. It happened at night, when the house was asleep. Suddenly, Gus could feel the ghost of cold, not real frost, but a phantom sensation of the biting wind that had once penetrated his skin. In those moments, he would wake up abruptly, his heart pounding and all his muscles clenching in anticipation of pain. He would hear the distant sounds of a siren or the creak of old wood, and his brain would immediately interpret them as a threat. He would quickly jump off Ethan's bed and run to the window. Outside was the same frosty night, the same frozen road, the same indifferent streetlights that had once been his only reference points in the darkness. But now he was inside. Gus would go to the window, sit on the wide sill, and press his forehead against the cold glass. He would look out at the street, and the cold he felt through the glass served as a reminder, not a punishment. He saw the vulnerability of that outside world and understood his victory. He was on the other side of the glass. Piper often found him in such moments. She wouldn't turn on the light, so as not to startle his fragile balance. She would quietly approach the window, sit next to him, and place her hand on his back. "It's okay, Gus," she would whisper. "You're not out there. You're here." Her hand, warm and steady, was a bridge between his past and present. Gus, feeling the familiar warmth, would relax. He would rub his head against her shoulder, and the quiet purr, which was now as customary as his breathing, would fill the silence. Piper understood that this wasn't just affection, it was confirmation. He was checking to make sure she hadn't disappeared. He became much more playful. The true house cat, not the cornered beast, had awakened in him. His favorite pastime became chasing a tiny, crumpled ball of foil across the carpet. He could spend hours training his street dexterity, performing somersaults and jumps that delighted Ethan. Ethan, who was usually stingy with emotions, now often teased Gus. He would dangle a string for him, and Gus would respond with a liveliness and eagerness that the phlegmatic Jasper lacked. Gus could play hide-and-seek with a laser pointer for hours. Ethan, sitting on the sofa, would laugh at his hilarious but precise jumps. This playfulness became proof of his complete recovery. There was no room left for fear, only for the joy of life. Jasper finally got used to it. If he used to simply ignore Gus, now he became patronizing toward him. One day, Gus, jumping carelessly onto a shelf, knocked a large vase onto himself. The vase fell with a dull thud, but didn't break. Jasper, who was dozing in the chair, didn't move. He just opened one eye, looked at the startled Gus, and closed it again, as if saying,
Deal with it. It happens.
It was complete acceptance. Jasper no longer saw Gus as a stranger. He saw someone who needed a home but was capable of defending it if required. Surprisingly, Gus also became a tuning fork for the family's health. Audrey noticed that if Piper was in a bad mood or upset, Gus would immediately abandon all his games and jump onto her lap. He would lie down and begin to purr so loudly, as if trying to vibrate the sadness out of her. He knew when someone needed warmth. He was their living ginger therapist. "You see?" Audrey would say to Ethan. "He knows when we're down. He's healing us. He brought something into this house that we were missing." Ethan only smiled. He no longer argued about the vet expenses or brought up the shelter. He felt that this cat, this ginger bundle of street wisdom and tenderness, was a gift they had received for their kindness. He became Ethan's shadow. Wherever Ethan went, Gus followed, waiting for the opportunity to jump onto his lap again. Gus especially liked it when Ethan worked on his computer, and the cat would settle right on his arms, preventing him from typing, demanding attention. Audrey discovered that her stress level had significantly decreased. Looking at Gus's serenity, she understood that most of her problems were manageable. Life wasn't as fragile as she had thought. She even started photographing him sleeping, collecting an entire gallery of his funny, relaxed poses. Piper became more open with her parents because of Gus. Her conversations with Ethan about the cat's health and behavior smoothly transitioned into discussions about her schoolwork, friends, and future. The cat became their common neutral ground where they could safely communicate. Everything in the house was now oriented around the two cats, though in different ways. Jasper's expensive, soft cat houses stood in the center, while Gus preferred windowsills, the backs of chairs, and, of course, Ethan's feet. He didn't strive for luxury. He was attracted by warmth and human proximity. Gus did not go under the bed that evening. He stayed in the corner on the soft blanket. He was not sleeping on the bed. He wasn't lying next to the people. He was just watching them from his corner, watching and absorbing the warmth and light. He didn't believe that this safety would last forever. He was simply enjoying the fact that it was lasting now. His wounds had healed, and his past had become just a quiet background memory that served only to emphasize the sweetness of his new, secure present. 3 months later. The snow outside the window had been replaced by the first timid greenery. The air was filled with the smell of thawing pavement. But for Gus, the change of seasons had only aesthetic significance. He no longer associated spring with hunger and new fights. Gus was lying on Ethan's lap, his favorite spot in the house. It was the leather upholstery of the recliner. The heat from his body was warming the fabric. The cat dozed, purring quietly and deeply like a small, contented motor. He was absolutely relaxed. His paws were stretched out. His head rested on Ethan's warm, soft stomach. Ethan had even bought himself a thick sweater, so Gus would be softer and more comfortable. His hand, the large, strong hand of an engineer, stroked Gus slowly, rhythmically, and in that movement was concentrated all the tenderness he had once hidden. He felt the weight of the cat, and that weight was an anchor for him, keeping him from his former emotional detachment. He no longer thought about work while stroking Gus. He had learned to turn off the internal engineer who demanded order and logic, and simply accept the warmth and chaos of a living creature. On the small coffee table in front of them stood a framed photograph. It wasn't just a family photo, but a symbol of their new beginning. Everyone was in it. Ethan, Audrey, Piper, Jasper, sitting important and aloof on the back of the sofa, and Gus pressed against Piper's legs. Piper had taken the photograph. Beneath it, she had attached a small card on which she had written in calligraphic script, "Second Chance." The chip issue was resolved 2 weeks after the first visit. The clinic reported, "The chip was registered in the database, but the last owner data was 10 years old and inactive. The phone number was disconnected. The address was an old industrial zone where the building had already been torn down. The owners either moved and didn't re-register the cat, or, more likely, got rid of him when he got old, or lost him and didn't look." Hearing this, Ethan didn't feel relief, but rather anger. "So they just dumped him like old furniture," he growled then. Audrey took his hand. "That means he's ours, completely ours, Gus. You chose us, and we won't abandon you," she said. From that moment on, Gus ceased to be a temporary resident. He became a family member. Each of them got their second chance. Gus received a home, warmth, daily food, and unconditional love. There was no room for a struggle for survival in his new life. His body recovered. The veterinarian confirmed he was healthy. He no longer thrashed around at night. The ghosts of cold had left him, and his soul was healed. His former scars, visible beneath his clean fur, became for the family not a sign of trauma, but medals for courage. Ethan received softness. The gesture he made that frosty night, opening the window, changed him forever. The cat taught him to be sensitive and attentive. He started hugging Audrey more often and talking to Piper more. His former sternness gave way to good-natured grumbling. Ethan began regularly buying Gus new toys, the most expensive they could afford, compensating for the poverty the cat had experienced. He even installed a special cat house on the balcony where Gus could sit, enjoying the warm spring air without risking being outside. Audrey received trust. The animal, which was broken, hunted, and traumatized, taught her to believe. She saw that even in the most difficult circumstances, salvation could be found if one opened up. Her maternal instinct, awakened by the sight of the tormented cat, made her feel needed again. She understood that their lives had been lacking this unconditional, accepting warmth. She felt that her house was no longer just walls and furniture, but a fortress protecting those she held dear. Piper received responsibility. Caring for Gus gave her a purpose. She decided that in the future she wanted to become a veterinarian or a volunteer. She started reading books on feline psychology to better understand Gus. Her friends noticed that she was calmer, more self-assured, and stopped spending all day on social media, preferring to spend time with the cat. She even organized a fundraiser at school for the local shelter, talking about Gus as a symbol that every animal deserves a chance. And finally, Jasper also got his chance, a chance at brotherhood. Their relationship transitioned into a phase of complete, respectful, peaceful coexistence. They shared the territory, the food bowl, and sometimes even the sofa. Jasper, lazy and wise, realized that this ginger living fire was not a threat, but a compliment. He respected Gus for his past, for the will that allowed him to survive. Sometimes, when Piper went to school, Jasper would walk up to Gus, who was sleeping on the sofa, and sit down next to him. He wouldn't touch him, but their whiskers touched the same airflow. This was their silent, feline acknowledgement. Gus would never return to the street. He knew what cold, hunger, and humiliation were, and he knew what warmth, safety, and love were. He made his choice that night at the traffic light, and life welcomed him into its embrace, giving him a new family. Neighbors who saw this smooth ginger cat sitting proudly on the windowsill often asked, "Is that the one from the road?" And they heard in reply, "That's our Gus. He is the one." His story became a quiet legend, confirming that kindness is not a weakness, but the most powerful force capable of changing lives. Audrey and Piper began regularly volunteering at the local shelter, bringing food and blankets. Ethan, although grumbling about the extra gas expenses, always loaded the trunk himself. He even bought a special extra-large SUV so it would be easier to transport boxes of humanitarian aid for animals. The family's life changed forever. Their house, which used to be just a place to sleep, was now filled with laughter, purring, and warmth. They became a real family, learning to speak not only with words, but also with gestures, touches, and care. Gus, that ginger symbol of a second chance, was the reason. His scars, which once screamed of pain, now spoke only of victory. He was a living, breathing reminder that even the most desperate creature can find love and rescue. Gus wakes up. He stretches long and gracefully, demonstrating every millimeter of his healthy, strong body. He jumps down from Ethan, who grumbles discontentedly, immediately missing his warmth. The cat walks to the window. He sits on the sill. Outside, it's snowing. Large, fluffy flakes are falling, and the temperature, judging by the frost on the glass, is not rising above 15 degrees below zero. But Gus looks at this scene not with panic, but with deep, absolute peace. He looks at the world that once tried to kill him and feels only gratitude. He is warm, he is fed, he is loved, he is home. He knows the price of cold, and that is why he values warmth. He turns and sees Jasper, who has just woken up and is descending from the sofa. Jasper slowly walks to Gus and sits down next to him on the windowsill. They sit side by side, two kings of their castle, looking out at the snowy kingdom. Gus rubs his head against Jasper. Jasper, without hissing or pulling away, allows it. It is his second chance, and he is taking it.